Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Miles, the head of training and consulting at Knology, and we are here for another installment of Knowledge Speaks, where we have conversations towards a more knowledgeable world. Now, a lot of times throughout these conversations, we are talking about things like the developing knowledge economy. We're talking about higher education and the research sector and how those areas all intersect with each other. And in a very timely manner, a few months ago, with their edition of Inside Higher Ed, we recently came across an article called "The Future of Higher Education is Occurring in the Margins." And in this article, they articulated that there are 5 key changes or areas of 5 new realities that we are facing across the higher education and research industry. And so we thought that for today's conversation, it would be really interesting and timely to essentially go through each of these 5 new realities that have been listed in the article and discuss them in more depth. So with that, I'm happy to welcome my colleagues with us. Would everyone like to just take 1 minute to introduce themselves to the audience?
Sure, I'll start. My name is Isaac Tabor. I'm the digital learning architect at Knowledge E. I'm responsible for all the digital learning development and delivery.
My name is Caryn Anderson. I'm the training and strategy expert here at Knowledge E, focused primarily on our training programs. I also deliver courses in areas of expertise, including our interdisciplinary excellence program.
Hi, my name is Emily Choynowski. I'm head of publishing at Knowledge E, and I oversee the academic publishing division and everything associated with publishing and author support services.
Hello, my name is Kamran Kardan. I'm the CEO and founder of Knowledge E, and happy to join another edition of Knowledge E Speaks.
All right, wonderful. Let's dive right in. Let's talk about
But Samantha, you didn't introduce yourself.
I did at the beginning. I said I'm the head of training and consulting.
Okay, yeah, I missed that.
I just said it so fast. All right, let's dive right in. Let's talk about the new reality that they've listed. Number 1, new content producers and distributors will continue to enter the marketplace, driving up competition and consumer choice while driving down prices. What do you guys think about that?
Who wants to start?
I will just say, on the one hand, I think it's great that there is a diversity of content beyond just what higher education produces, because there's always been a tension in higher education between in universities sort of being much more theoretically focused, whereas a lot of times people need more practical stuff. And some of this new content from new sources has a tendency to be maybe more focused in that direction. On the other hand, I feel like it's hard for I love higher education and being able to have a broader perspective. So there's a tension there for me, for sure.
I think also, sorry, Isaac.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Emily. No, please.
I was just going to say briefly, I think it also does recall some of the more vocational, practical forms of education that certainly in the UK we used to have. A lot of the polytechnics, you could go and learn useful. They were outcome based. You learned to be an engineer, you learned to do plumbing courses and things like that. And I think to a certain extent, while the topics might have changed and shifted to a more digital era, the concepts are by no means new.
I think there's actually, I've seen that universities have recognized that there's sort of there's gaps in what they're teaching and in their curriculum, and also they're not necessarily always meeting the demands of students. But universities in general are larger institutions that maybe can't move that quickly to adapt their curricula, especially if the curriculum of a particular course is attached to a degree program. And so those outcomes are webbed and mapped in with the outcomes of the rest of the program. There's a whole complicated process involved there. And so I think content providers popping up like this, part of it is a result of universities not being able to adapt quick enough, even though they see that the demand is there.
Mm.
Yeah, in general, we have this trend with everything moving so fast and the whole issue of the economies of attention. We're more and more getting used to bite-sized learning, breaking down learning elements into a faster way of gathering the information that we require. And this has been applied from kids to adults, where we need to find something or we want to find out about something. There's different sources where we watch a 3-minute video and we'll try and learn how to do it. And given that everything's fast-paced and moving forward very quickly, having bite-sized information and information as you need seems more convenient to a lot of people. And of course, in order to have that as part of an education system, you need to be very agile, and it's going against the norms. So this creates a gap in the market for various companies to create content that can be consumed on the go, bite-sized and relevant to the application of that knowledge.
I think that also, though, raises the question, or as it's going to need to be developed as this new reality plays out, the question for me is, if people are putting in new content, but it's available in all these different ways, is a question sort of certification and whether or not that matters, right? So from at least a university degree, an employer says, oh, they have a degree, I can trust that they have the competency. Whereas like, oh, well, I took some content here and I took some content here. If I'm a self-learner, if I'm self-motivated to learn and I'm actually getting content that's helping me, that's awesome. But if it's not recognized by anybody and that interferes in my ability to have a career, there's a little bit of a challenge there for me.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why we've got two movements. We've got on the higher education side, you've got universities getting into practical and sometimes vocational courses, or making there some certain courses available on MOOCs. And at the same time, on the other hand, you've got the content creators who are providing this content for individuals who really do not see the application of that degree and certification. They're just about the learning. So you've got that movement in both these directions.
Well,
and also, sorry, Sam. No, just one last point. I was going to say also, Caryn, this by no means applies to all fields. I wouldn't want doctors to think this way, but employers are more and more valuing the self-learner. If you come to an interview and you say, well, I don't have a degree in this, but I took all these courses online, and maybe they're not even certified, but I can show what I can do. And it's much more performance-based. And that's also just because of the developments in technology. What you're actually going to be doing in your job is going to be so different in 5 years from now than it is now. The fact that you are able to learn by yourself is so powerful now.
Yeah, you touched on a very important point, Isaac, that some of this could be subject related. As you said, you don't want a surgeon who's learned how to exactly, or a pilot who's just like learned how to fly using some
YouTube videos.
Exactly, yeah.
But also, Isaac, you mentioned another point, which is what the employer looks for, and I think that's so relevant. So I know my division is certainly going, we're going through hiring processes right now, and I know some of the others here today are as well. And it is that balance of, where do you put your baseline cutoff point? Do I look for a degree and say no one without, if you don't have a degree, I'm not even going to evaluate you? Or do I have to kind of go through more subjective things and say, well, there's no baseline certification here, but I like the way you've presented yourself in your cover letter and your CV, so it's worth moving you up to the next step, and we'll see where we go from there. And I think, again, if one of the ways to get people more generally to buy into this more diverse educational background is very much employer-led.
Mm-hmm.
Just have to go sideways on that, though, because I'm really nervous about particularly in these big companies where they're using artificial intelligence to screen CVs. Right. That if those AI protocols and algorithms are not allowing for that, then there's a little bit of a challenge there.
Absolutely.
Really
absolutely. Well, and I don't know how we're hearing more and more that employers are valuing soft skills development, right? And again, going back to that thing about not knowing what technologies you're going to be using later on anyway. I don't know how those algorithms would screen for soft skills. I mean, it's literally impossible to put those on paper.
Well, that's probably another
Buzzword.
knowledge e-speak.
Yeah.
Sorry.
On the, I was going to say on the note of soft skills. Sorry.
No, it's good. We've already, just like all these conversations, we get a little seed and we grow it into all kinds of branches. So that's awesome. Let's talk about point number 2 from the article, which states institutional control of higher education will decrease and the power of higher education consumers will increase. And I think you guys have already started touching on a lot of this by talking about what are the needs of the employment market and what is it that students and learners and end users actually want. Is there anything you want to elaborate on further, specifically around this idea of that shift in control from the institution to the consumer?
There's a question about who is the consumer a little bit. It's not really a question, but we talked a lot about what employers want. But if it's student-led in terms of what the students, whether they're undergraduate students or mid-career professionals, for example, it's a question about whether that student-led consumption of knowledge is in fact in line with the employer-led consumption, but it definitely seems to make a difference in terms of higher education. Like Isaac was saying earlier, higher education institutions are not as nimble at adjusting to that. On the flip side, higher ed itself, in terms of its funding structures, I've noticed, having been teaching in higher ed for almost 20 years now, that like the institutions themselves have had to focus on consumers because that's the only place they can get the revenue to keep the system going.
I think that's really interesting. If I could add, one of the things that popped to my mind when I read that section of the article is the idea of how many more universities are shifting towards student-centered curriculum design. And I think that that's really evident. You can see that being successfully rolled out across universities all over the world. And I think a really interesting point here, which links back to the first part of the article, is that because we are exposed to so much more access to education and different learning formats, we know what we want, right? We're like informed consumers with the products we buy, and we're becoming more and more informed consumers with the way that we learn. So you can take an online module and after like 5 minutes, you go like, nah, this isn't my jam. I don't like the way this is presented. And then you could take another online course and you're like, I'm into it. I really like the way they've used videos or graphics, or I like these assignments. And I even noticed with myself, teaching in the business sector in Dubai a few years ago, there were certain students who you were able to give them the autonomy of saying like, okay, well, your capstone project for this course, you have a couple of options, and I want you to choose the one that is going to work best for you. So giving them that authority, that knowledge about how they learn best, the types of ways that they want to consume information and apply it, that's something that I see growing and growing. And as more young people get to the age where they're going to university, they are more empowered because, they have this personalized learning device in their phone and they go, I know this is what I want and this is the way I want it. And I would like you to teach me in this way. And that's a total paradigm shift.
Go, Isaac.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to say, learners knowing what kind of learning experience they want, that's the real key, because having worked in doing instructional design and course transformation for universities, getting the buy-in from faculty to digitize their courses in a way that's exciting for students is not always the easiest. I mean, it's a lengthy process, but often they want to just kind of go one for one or like for like and say, well, this is what I've done for 20 years. So we're just going to throw this online and it'll be fine because it's always worked, but that's not the way anymore. Students are exposed to incredible visuals through YouTube or through TV or Netflix or whatever they're watching. They're exposed to incredible audio design from all the podcasts that they're listening to. They're exposed to incredible social experiences with all the social learning tools that they're using. All of that, they expect all of that to be incorporated into their learning experience. And new content providers that are coming on the scene, they hire young people, they hire sort of progressive thinkers to do that for them. But when you're working with faculty who've been teaching the same courses for 20, 30 years, getting that buy-in is difficult. And that's why you see a lot of centers for technologically enhanced learning in universities working on just getting that buy-in, having done that for the last 5, 10 years, making progress, but it's slow progress.
Yeah.
And going back to that first trend, I think that's why those new content providers are doing so well as well.
But if I could add to that, I have so many friends in academia who are lecturers, and I think particularly in the past year with COVID, well, God, 2 years now, everyone's been forced online. So often it's not necessarily the faculty not having the buy-in, it's the university themselves. So the faculty have just been left high and dry. They've just been told, you have to shift online. We're not providing you with any equipment. You have to pay for all the equipment, for the good lighting, the good audio, all of that. You have to pay for that yourself. And some of these, they're not even faculty, they're short-term contractors with no money for this. They're on 0 hours contracts. They're not given, let alone the equipment support, like they're not given the tech support, they're not given training. They've just been told, off you go. Half of them are told, you're young, you obviously ingest this content yourselves on YouTube, so you know what to do. And they're just left and told, oh, and by the way, that's 100 hours of work that you need to deliver by tomorrow because the students are coming back like next week. Bye.
And I think you've touched.
Yeah, sorry.
I think you've touched on something key there, which is that the university's move to digital learning has been mostly reactionary because of COVID. It was there before COVID. I don't want to make a blanket statement and say that, but in large part reactionary, whereas these new content providers that have come on the scene that have been around for 5+ years, they've been prepping for this all that time. It hasn't been necessarily reactionary. And the whole reactionary movement towards online learning has given it a bad rep, because there have been some terrible learning experiences as a result, and just terrible experiences on both sides, not just learning and delivering. And
well, I was going to say, I think one aspect that's really also contributed to the bad reputation has been, not all, but some universities that I know of have perhaps been a bit unprincipled. And the moment these people have, the faculty and stuff, have made the recordings, the university has gone, right, we've got those, you're fired, bye. And then carried on using these recordings, which again, it doesn't exactly breed an enthusiasm within the staffing to faculty members to really contribute and make engaging content, because they know that the moment they do, they could be out on their asses.
And that certainly puts the higher education institution, without them realizing what they're doing, that's forcing them to lose control of the process of education and who the consumers are that are coming to them. If they're doing those kinds of things, it is part of the reason that they lose control. We're talking a little bit about format and modes of delivery, but I also want to go back to the content question, because I think part of the reason that things are shifting, as we're talking about in this point, is that the difference between a focus on subject-based learning versus problem-based learning. And if, as we are, as consumers and students are becoming more and more focused on problem-based learning, and like, I have a problem, I need this particular knowledge to help me solve that problem. When you're solving a problem, you're not going to spend time learning something that isn't relevant, right? And so subject-based learning is saying you want to learn the subject area, so let me tell you everything you need to know. And I think that the shift to problem-based learning, particularly given the interconnections in our global society and the complex social problems we are facing, like the pandemic, that have all these different disciplines involved, you can't just focus on subject-based learning. And I think that's something that universities, I don't know what they're going to do in the long run.
Well,
yeah, and a lot of it, just to add, is not just predominantly consumer or student-led. Part of it is market-led as well. Like, as the requirements change, as the environment change, as the market needs change, then the capability to cater to those needs also changes as well. And part of it on the consumer or on the student part is the ways students are getting used to consuming knowledge and learning. So these different factors are also contributing to that change, and the higher education sector would need to really have a closer ear to the ground on both these aspects to be able to adapt. And even if it's based on choice or more student-led, as Sam, you mentioned, it's having that format to enable it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cameron, that's a really nice segue into number 3, which states, with near universal access to digital devices and the internet, students will seek from colleges the same things they are getting from music, movie, and newspaper industries. Do you want to dive a little bit deeper into that aspect of the technology conversation?
Yeah, so from my side, also being involved in developing a product that is on a similar concept, I think we are getting used to having a lot of choice and being able to take what we need. So take, for example, music. You no longer have to buy an album to really to use it. You can have access to all the music that you like, and really listen to the ones that you like more. You've got things like Netflix, where you've got a whole library of content to watch, and then you pick what you want to choose, rather than like waiting for a movie to come out on the theater and, okay, I've got 2 or 3 choices. So also on accessibility to information, you've got things like Zendy, like providing unlimited access to content for a nominal fee. So that's on the digital library and accessibility for individuals front. So if we want to apply the same to the higher education sector, it's more having that choice, back to the previous point on, okay, it's more like personalized learning. So not everyone has the same learning experience going through a degree. It's, yeah, there's a process, but outcomes for that process, of course, we talked about the medical field, and we talked about, but maybe someone in the medical field would be trying to solve a specific problem by having a more interdisciplinary approach. So I think that choice, or that personalization, is something interesting to watch and to see how the higher education sector will adapt to that.
I think you're so spot on, Cameron. And what that made me think of, though, was you were talking in part about the personalization of the content. And then what that also, the way that you get from, sort of an unlimited movie subscription or book subscription or whatever it is that we have available to us now. But what happens in that environment, if you're getting a personalized learning, what we need to make sure is what you also get today is social media, where you can have communities that build around that content. Because if we're getting very personalized in terms of knowledge consumption, if we lose the community and the social aspect of it, then that's going to be a real problem for higher education. And so being able to design knowledge products and options that are enabled to be personal, but to maintain the ability to have that social connection like you would in a class environment or in a campus environment, I think is going to be important.
Really good point, Karyn. All right.
I think there's been, I'll mention one more thing. There's been advances, it seems like, in sort of digital course design, that the corporate learning development field is always one step ahead of higher education, just because they have that agility and that nimbleness and that ability to do more personalized learning. And something that came out of there quite a few years ago was the idea of microlearning. So having learning outcomes broken down, granularized into sort of short learning objectives, 2 to 7 minute videos on one learning objective, and just creating a whole bank of learning objectives and letting, in this case, I suppose, employees of a company choose their own learning and sort of curate their own learning. And universities have actually taken this on. There are quite a few studies of universities experimenting with microlearning with great results. Most of them show great results. And it's mostly breaking down lectures, pre-recorded lectures, into shorter modules. But now that's combining with adaptive learning, which is really interesting, where learners can actually kind of curate their own learning path within these broken down learning objectives and broken down learning assets, which takes into account AI and sort of new technologies. That's very exciting. Some universities have taken that on in a big way. I know MIT is taking it on, which is no surprise, obviously. But it's coming back to that idea of learners wanting to choose what they're going to use. As long as it's student-centered, it also needs kind of an authentic assessment piece at the end, because they obviously haven't all been seeing the same content. But then again, that authentic assessment piece ties in with that idea of community building. of being out in the community and of having your sort of communities of practice. So hopefully we'll see more of that in universities.
Really, really good insights, Isaac. Yeah, I agree. So,
And
all right.
one element on the assessment also is peer assessment, like you having peers commenting and being able to analyze the work that you've done. And that's part of the learning process as well. But definitely one common denominator of all of that was accessibility. So you do need to have that choice to be able to have that personal experience. You can't have like one or two, okay, blue or green. You can't really call that personal with that kind of limitation. So that accessibility, that's wide array of options, that's a key factor for this to work.
Yeah, UNICEF is funding a kind of an awareness campaign at the moment for universities that may not have the resources to build out these programs themselves, and is trying to push them to kind of create curated lists of available informal learning materials, whether that's YouTube videos, open educational resources, podcasts, open access materials, and to sort of provide that to students in hopes of students feeling more in control of their learning and having that more personalized learning experience.
And can I just jump in on behalf of librarians everywhere? This is where the library field has been trending for a long time, is as with the growth of the internet and all of the resources, librarians have increasingly been taking it upon themselves to be able to be some of the assistants to higher education universities, particularly, to be able to help curate and aggregate all that kind of relevant content.
Yeah, really good point. Okay, that leads us to number 4. A knowledge economy model based on outcomes will eclipse the industrial era model of higher education based on process. I have some thoughts on this one, but does anybody else want to kick off the comment? No, I can kick it off. So, I mean, definitely, I think this is obvious in everything that we see, referencing Karyn, you said a few minutes ago in the conversation, you had talked about the idea of problem-based learning as opposed to subject learning. And I think, we've been talking about the medical field a little bit. The thing that comes to my mind right away is some work that we've done here in the region where we had helped a group of universities transform their medical education curriculum for their medical schools. And you could very clearly see that the entire curriculum was process oriented. It said, year 1, the students need to understand the anatomy from the top of the head down to the rib cage. And then they move towards the anatomy of the digestive system. And first they have to learn this, and then they can learn the different elements of how, once they know the anatomy and they can memorize it, then they can move on to step 2 and step 3 and step 4. And then all of a sudden the government said, hey guys, I know you used to teach this curriculum in 7 years, you now have 5. So cut 2 years worth of content out. And all of the professors were like, this is not possible. But the way that it is possible is by looking at what are the outcomes. So instead of going step 1, you do this process, step 2, you learn this, step 3, you learn this, you say, what is a problem-based learning approach that we can take where they actually have to apply the knowledge? So we're not going to test them on if they can memorize the name of different bones and different systems of the body. We're going to ask them questions that requires them to apply that knowledge correctly as if they were administering healthcare on a human, because that's what we want them to be able to do when they graduate. And so it was like flipping everything on its head. It was starting backwards. It was saying, what do we want them to be able to do once they graduate? And let's work backwards from there. And that is revolutionary. It's necessary. It has to happen from here on out with all programs, not just medicine. But it's a really hard pill to swallow if you have been in that system of learning for so long, to just say, oh my gosh, I have to completely change my approach to this. So we've had some wonderful experiences watching this transformation happen at more than 28 medical schools in the region. And it's been successful. It's been successful and it actually works.
And the other thing that's related to that, you used a perfect example in the medical field, but that's even within one traditional discipline, when in fact, many of the people who are going to university or trying to advance their education are attacking problems that are not one discipline. And so the idea of having to be able to pull a little bit from, you're trying to solve a pandemic, a little bit from health, a little bit from economics, a little bit from sociology, you know, like you have to pull all these things together. And so being able to rethink and reorient our brains that way, particularly as university professors and scholars, like it's definitely a challenge.
And it's also planting that seed in the minds of the younger generation, in kids. And like, it's like for kids to not think about jobs of the future, about solving the problems of the future. So it's no longer about, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a doctor. It's more about, okay, I want to solve this problem. I want to, speaking of travel to space and all the different elements that go into that, and living on Mars, or like exploring other places. So it's really starting from a very, very young age as well.
Emily has this, you have to let Emily speak, because I know she's sad, because part of all of this, it sounds exciting, but what's really sad is losing the whole sort of well-rounded person.
Well, not just that, but I think losing the traditional pursuit of academia. Academia has existed in its sort of pure ivory tower state, which, you know, there are bad things about that, obviously, and it can be elitist, and it can be riven with unfairness, but at the same time, it exists for the pursuit of learning in its purest form, and I think that's really important. I don't think we should lose it. I was thinking the whole way through Kamran says that, I'm like, there aren't any problems I want to solve. I have no problems I want to solve. I don't, you know, I just want to sit in my library and study and write articles that probably only 50 people will read, but those 50 people will be really interested in them, and they don't solve any problems at all, but it's still, you know, I think it's important to maintain checks and balances in all of this. The academia, in its traditional, old-fashioned, whichever format you want to I think it's important to retain that to a certain extent, because not everyone is a problem solver. In the same way, not everyone is equipped to be a scientist or an engineer. It's
life is not
the options.
And life is not just problems. And if you're a problem solver and that means you view everything as a problem, that means you're going to create problems where they don't exist. And life is much bigger than the problems we have to solve. And the type of learning, particularly in the arts and humanities, that provides that cultural roundedness actually makes life richer, but B, I would also argue that having that diversity of perspective, of topics that aren't necessarily right within the problem area, actually allow you to be better problem solvers. There are tons of research and books about some of the greatest inventors and scientific scholars and researchers in the world made some of their greatest inventions because of their musical ability or their writing ability or their artistic sentiment helped them see that new thing.
And that's exactly the point. It's confirming that all those elements can contribute to, like, and problem solving doesn't necessarily mean a problem, or like, you know, in its literal sense. It you know, life is about challenges, is about like when you've got a maths problem, it's not a real problem. It's something that you're resolving. You're putting a solution. You're putting an answer to it. Like. So what you said does not really contradict. It actually reaffirms that all of these do play a part. It's not undermining a certain area like in humanities or in arts. It's actually more, it's suggesting that all of these are even more interconnected, and they play an important role in that holistic approach towards our life on this planet.
But Kamran, don't you think that that's something that has the potential to easily get lost as we and forgotten, because as we focus on this consumer based, you know, I mean, I know my nephews, they only want to eat chips, you know, like if I let them decide what we eat for dinner, we get a little bit of a different story. So maybe that's the place where higher education, if it can adapt to some of this more consumer-led, but also be sort of, I don't want to say, I don't know, moral authority sounds a little bit rich, but like to be the one that helps remind people that there's a broader thing that they ought to be also considering that they choose from, might I don't know.
Yeah. If you look at, for example,
those-
activities of UNESCO, for example, you brought up that example. It's about like cultural heritage. It's about preserving languages, cultures, history, artifacts. So it's that global knowledge about our history, our existence, future, and everything's interconnected. So I definitely see that point that you're mentioning, that there is that danger of losing focus. But in my mind, all of these are connected.
Also, I think it's important to see the difference between meeting consumers' needs in terms of content quality and delivery, but also realizing that there are the keepers of knowledge. You can't just, those gates open when the knowledge keepers want them to open, right? So I don't necessarily think consumers are completely in control of what the outcomes are going to be. We should make them in control of the delivery of how they want that content to be delivered.
But there's that question of who the consumer is, because we've been talking about the consumer as the student, but increasingly, again, I'm going back to the UK because it's the milieu I'm most familiar with, but increasingly the consumer of education is in many respects the government. The government is driving what is being taught and how it's being taught in the universities. It's driving who's getting funding and what they're getting funding for. And what this is resulting in is a number of what are considered unnecessary subjects, humanities being one of them, which breaks my heart, are being sidelined or even undermined by the government actively because what they want taught, and they perceive themselves as the end consumer because they want a workforce that conforms to their targets, is more, the hard sciences, more practical content. So they want nurses, they want doctors, they want engineers, and they're sidelining the soft skills. And I think, as Kamran and Caryn said, the necessity and the value of these soft skills for employers who are also a consumer ultimately is very much being lost within the overall narrative, both by the government-led narratives of we want workforces to do this, the university narratives where they're saying, well, we're focusing on these courses because you'll get a better job, and then the press just regurgitating all of this. And I think there is a risk that we overlook the definition that the consumer is the student. The student should have a decision about what they learn and how they learn it. And it shouldn't be entirely forced top down based on other people, other organizations' needs.
I think that point about soft skills, though, is a really interesting one because yes, it's a government is focused on industry areas that they want to develop from an economic perspective, for example. But the employers, and I think Isaac and Kamran both mentioned it earlier, also focused on the need for soft skills. And Isaac, what you also just said is those soft skills include critical thinking and things, but it also includes the ability to have information literacy and assess information appropriately. And this is a challenge that we often have in libraries is that, if you measure like customer satisfaction, they can be perfectly satisfied with the wrong answer because they don't know it's the wrong answer. And so information literacy is about also being able to help people understand how to consume what they're learning as well. And I mean, obviously I can go sideways on that. I'm not going to, but I do think it's also, there is room for those soft skills, and it's important to do what you said, Emily, is to really think about who is the consumer, and it is all three, the students, the government, and the employers in the long run.
Well, and I just want to add like another perspective to that mix around market needs. I think that there's also a key consideration that there are big percentages of the market who still want a traditional learning experience. Like if you think about people, and listen, I'm going to be really interested to see what happens to these kids who have grown up with COVID and who have grown up like from the time that they can remember learning online. But I know even if you were to take myself, my little sister is way younger than us and she's a whole younger generation. But if you ask her, would you prefer to do a traditional university experience, walking down the halls and having classes and having the clubs and, going to the mess hall? That's what she wants. She misses that human interaction. And I think a lot of people do. And maybe we'll see a surge back to more traditional forms of learning after COVID passes. Maybe we won't. Maybe blended is the only thing that we'll have. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see. I think there's still going to be people who want a traditional learning experience, just as there's going to be lots of people who want an online experience with just the skills they need. They need to learn how to code for their job. So that's what they want because their time is precious. But I think the market is diverse, humanity is diverse, and people will want different things. So I'm going to be really interested to see kind of what higher ed looks like 8 to 10 years from now, you know, because I still think we have a few years of this pandemic ahead of us. And
Absolutely.
Right. But yeah, I don't know. We're humans. I think we like socializing. I think we like being together in groups.
Animals.
But let's not forget the other. I totally agree, Sam, but let's not forget the other reasons why students lean towards online learning, which is sometimes they want to enroll in a university that's 1,000 miles from their home, you know, and they wouldn't be able to move there. Just accessibility, you know, or someone in a developing country who wants to be taught by a university in, you know, a more established university somewhere. All these reasons, or someone who can't move away from home because they're working 2 jobs already. Or, you know, I think what I'm trying to get to is maybe it's not all about students choosing digital learning because they want to be in control of their outcomes and they want to be in control of the modes of delivery. Maybe there's also just very practical reasons behind it.
Yeah, really good point. And I think we can agree there's room for all kinds, right? Like there's a need for all kinds and there's room for all kinds. All right, guys, I'm just aware of time. I want to make sure we hit this 5th and final point, which is the dominance of time-bound degrees and just-in-case education will diminish. Meanwhile, non-degree certifications and just-in-time education will increase in status and value. I think we've touched a lot on this throughout the conversation, but does anybody have any kind of synthesizing or summarizing remarks that specifically relate to this point?
Wasn't there a case of, for example, Tesla saying that they don't require university degrees for you know, for their employment? There was something similar from Google as well, but Tesla definitely, I read something about the news. So again, a lot of it is market driven and industry driven on the requirements. And traditionally, you've had placement programs where even students, they would go and they will learn completely the ways of that new company. And usually this happened with larger organizations. So I think that industry and the market has a huge role to play. And already, as we discussed, we're seeing the shift from the industry, but we're also seeing the shift in the higher education sector to adapt to that specific need in terms of revamping and providing more options to learn for people that are not on the traditional degree or higher degree path.
And I like to build on that to propose what many universities do know, but many do not or haven't been pursuing, which is, in reality, we've been talking as if, oh, well, higher education is doing this and industry is doing that and students are this, but particularly with industry and government is doing this, is that I think one of the key hopes for higher education is to really focus on doing more actual partnership with industry and government, and really not saying, well, we are this provider, but how do we work together and leverage each other's strengths? And so I think that the ability that we have for the diversity of content, the diversity of methods, the diversity of providers, higher education shouldn't look at that as a threat, look at these as potential partners.
Yeah, really good point, Karyn.
But we even see the changes in dynamics for some of the providers of digital content in education, where the content is actually created in partnership with higher education and having that academic certification and research methods behind the products that are developed. So again, another example of that close collaboration between industry and academia.
Yeah.
Well, one last point, which is not related to that, but which we didn't even touch on, I just realized, is cost. I mean, university degrees, the cost of university degrees is only going up. And so it's only natural that students would look elsewhere to try and get their education. The cost of university degrees is going up. The cost of salaries, or the cost of living is going up. Salaries are not necessarily reflecting that right now in general around the world. It's only natural.
Yeah, many students finishing university with huge debts before even they enter into the job market. So if they have a choice between reducing that and still having those learning outcomes, of course, that would, because of the market changes in the market requirements, then that would become an obvious choice.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. That's a good point.
Lots for university leaders to think about.
Sure is. Are there any other final thoughts or closing remarks? All right. Well, listen, everyone, it has been another wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And if you're watching or listening, thank you for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Bye and take care.